The marble of Rome gleamed under torchlight, but the glow deceived. Behind polished stone and chants of loyal crowds, darkness stirred, a darkness no empire could contain. Rome was at its height, powerful, wealthy, feared across continents. Yet in its heart sat a man whose hunger would turn triumph into terror. Gay Caesar, remembered as Caligula, at first he was adored. The young hare had survived tragedy after tragedy, a symbol of Rome's resilience. Crowds called him beloved of the gods. But gods in Rome were feared as much as worshipped. And when Caligula began to see himself not as a man, but as a living god, the empire entered a nightmare it would never forget. This was not battlefield cruelty, nor the strictness of Roman law. It was intimate, unsettling. Caligula's power reached into the Senate, the legions, the bedrooms, the temples, the sacred bonds that held families together. Desire became domination. Lust became a weapon. Every man, woman, even the gods could be defiled to prove his supremacy. Whispers spread, incest, sacrilege. Noble matrons dragged from their homes, sacred virgins violated. What begins as whispers grows into screams. What begins as indulgence decays into horror. Rome had conquered the world, but under Caligula, its gravest enemy sat on the throne. Caligula was born into Rome's greatest legacy. His father, Germanicus, was a hero of the people, a general whose victories along the Rhine inspired loyalty through admiration, not fear. His mother, Agrena the Elder, was Augustus' granddaughter, tying him directly to the empire's founder. His blood led with promise, as if destiny had etched his name into eternity. As a child, he was adored. Soldiers called him Caligula, Little Boots, for the tiny sandals he wore while marching alongside his father. To them he was charming, an innocent mascot of the legions. But in Rome, innocence never lasted. Tragedy struck early. Germanicus died, perhaps poisoned, leaving whispers of conspiracy in his wake. Agrena and Caligula's brothers were ensnared in imperial politics. Accused of treason and condemned, one by one, his relatives perished. Only Caligula survived. Survival demanded silence. He learned to wear masks. Obedience before Tiberius. Charm before the people. Patience while biding his time. Behind boyish smiles grew a shadow born of grief, humiliation, and the constant reminder that in Rome life could be snatched at any moment. When Tiberius finally died, Caligula ascended. Rome erupted in joy. Senators, soldiers, citizens all hailed him as savior. He was Germanicus' son, Augustus' blood, the promise of a golden age restored. Yet the adoration of the masses is a dangerous fire. It inflates the ego, blinds the heart, convinces even a fragile man that he is untouchable, destined to rule not as a man, but as a god. Caligula's inheritance was more than a throne. It was the illusion of eternity, and from that illusion his darkest desires would emerge. Before Caligula, Rome was a city of rules, traditions, and sacred codes. At its heart was the family, the doys. Fathers ruled absolutely. Mothers guarded household honor, and children carried the lineage forward with duty. Family was not private. It was the foundation of Rome itself. Religion stood as a pillar of life. Gods were everywhere in hearths, towering temples, in augurs, reading birds' flights. Sacred vows were guarded with trembling devotion. The Vestal virgins chosen in childhood were bound by 30 years of chastity. Their purity was said to keep Rome alive. To break that vow endangered the empire itself. Even pleasure had limits. Banquets, games, and spectacles filled the city, but excess followed rules. What was sacred remained untouchable. What was forbidden stayed hidden. Rome thrived not by destroying tradition, but by preserving it. Ritual law and order held chaos at bay. This was the Rome Caligula inherited, a city of discipline and dignity. Emperors held power, but memory of the Republic still lingered. Morality, at least as aspiration, guided the people, but Caligula would not preserve these bonds. He would tear them apart. Family, religion, honor, the sacred foundations of Rome, would become his stage. What was once guarded with reverence would be desecrated for spectacle. The empire's rules were about to collapse beneath the will of one man. At first, Caligula's reign shimmered with hope. People celebrated him as a deliverer from Tiberius's shadow. Coins bore his image. Temples echoed his name. Rome rejoiced, believing a golden age had arrived. But months in, Caligula fell ill. Ancient accounts tell of fever, trembling, and a mind descending into darkness. When he recovered, the man Rome adored was gone. In his place stood a figure consumed by paranoia, cruelty, and a hunger to test the limits of power. Ruling armies and commanding senators was no longer enough. Caligula wanted control over the most private corners of Roman life. Bodies, families, sacred vows. He began to see himself as divine. Statues of gods were remade in his likeness. He dressed as Jupiter, Apollo, Venus. Rome had worshipped emperors before, but never one who demanded devotion in bedrooms, councils, and temples alike. Desire became domination. Crossing the forbidden religion, kinship, even morality was performance. Humiliation was spectacle. Whispers grew. Incest with sisters, defilement of sacred vows, corruption of noble households. Rumor hardened into fear. Private sin became public command. Rome thought it had welcomed a savior. Instead, it had crowned a man who wielded the empire's sanctity as a weapon. The descent had begun. Of all the whispers in Caligula's Rome, none carried more dread than those of incest. Family was sacred, the foundation of law, society, and morality. To violate it was to attack Rome itself. Yet Caligula's relationships with his sisters Agrena, Julia Livilla, and especially Drusilla became legends of corruption. Drusilla was his favorite. Ancient writers describe her not as a sister, but as a partner in his passions. He kissed her in public with a tenderness reserved for lovers, not siblings. She sat beside him at banquets, councils, even in the Senate. To Rome, this was no longer family. It was blasphemy dressed as royalty. Rumors went further. Some claimed Caligula violated his sisters in palace halls, reducing bloodlines to possession. Guests were paraded, wives and daughters seized before their eyes. Even that horror pad against the fear of incest. If family bonds could be broken, nothing was safe. When Drusilla died suddenly, Rome was shocked. Caligula mourned her as a husband, not a brother. Public mourning swept the empire. Statues, shrines, honors, all unprecedented. Some sources suggest he declared her a goddess, Panthea, the all-goddess. Grief soon turned rancid, deprived of Drusilla. His hunger spread. He turned to other sisters, demanding submission. Agrena and Livilla were accused of conspiracy, stripped of honor, exiled. Family once sacred became a cycle of pleasure, betrayal, and destruction. The moral weight was immense. Incest was pollution in Rome. Bringing it to the center of power stained the empire itself. With each act, Caligula proved no law, god, or custom could bind him. By breaking the bonds of blood, he shattered Rome's spirit. Family, the empire's foundation, had become his stage of humiliation. Rome's religion was more than ceremony. It was the city's lifeblood. Every hearth, every temple, every prayer mattered. The Vestal virgins chosen as children, and sworn to 30 years of chastity, were living guardians of Rome's safety. To violate them invited the gods' wrath. Yet Caligula, drunk on his own divinity, treated the sacred as a playground. Ancient accounts suggest he sought not admiration but domination. He would summon the Vestals under the guise of duty, testing obedience, bending sacred vows to his will. In a city that revered purity, the thought of their defilement struck terror into every heart. If the empire's spiritual guardians could be touched, nothing remained safe. His blasphemy reached the gods themselves. Statues were altered to bear his likeness. Temples were rededicated to him. Rituals once sacred now celebrated the emperor. Worship became performance. Every act sent the same message. Divinity was his to command, manipulate, and conquer. The moral shock waves were immense. Senators whispered in fear. Noble families trembled. Rome's greatest strength, sacred restraint, was stripped bare. Even the gods could not shield the innocent. Yet the people continued to celebrate him, reverence and horror blurred. Caligula's mastery was complete. Terror hidden behind divinity, lust behind authority. By desecrating the sacred, he showed Rome that nothing not gods, not law, not family, was untouchable. In this empire of marble and blood, law and piety could no longer protect the innocent. Caligula had bent gods and defiled sanctity, proving his appetite had no limit. Caligula's cruelty extended far beyond the palace. Rome's nobility, once secure, became pawns in his grotesque games. Power was measured not in law or armies, but in how completely he could humiliate others. Senators, wives, daughters of patricians, companions of the imperial household, all were instruments of his dominion. Feasts turned into stages of degradation. Guests arrived expecting banquets and entertainment, only to witness scenes that twisted morality into madness. Noble matrons were forced into submission, coerced into acts that shattered Roman decorum. To resist meant exile or worse. To comply meant survival. Every act proved Caligula's will surpass law, family, and even decency. The horror was amplified by performance. Violations occurred publicly. Families watched as loved ones were reduced to objects. Senators who debated policy in marble chambers now witnessed their households stripped of dignity. Fear and fascination intertwined. No one could look away. Caligula observed and orchestrated with precision. Every glance, every touch, every act was a message. Rome's highest citizens could be conquered as easily as its distant provinces. Pleasure and pain became one instrument, a tool of terror. By turning intimacy into a weapon, he demonstrated a perverse genius. Obedience was not enough. He demanded corruption of respect itself. The mighty gravelled, morality crumbled, and the empire's foundation trembled. Caligula had not just seized power, he had transformed it into spectacle. Rome's elite were no longer rulers or guardians of law. They were witnesses, participants, victims of cruelty that turned sacred and noble into instruments of terror. Caligula's perversion did not stay within palace walls. He turned the city itself into a stage. The palace was his theatre, Rome its backdrop. Every citizen a potential audience. Pleasure and terror became one performance designed to awe and frighten. Matrons and maidens were summoned from homes, dressed in finery, only to be stripped bare before the emperor. Senators' daughters, symbols of honor, became tools of his whim. Prostitutes mingled with noble women, blurring social order and chaos. Compliance was survival. Refusal meant exile, imprisonment, or worse. Caligula staged feasts where lust was public. Families watched the humiliation of their own. Every act broadcasted a single truth. In his Rome, power over life, morality, and desire belonged to him alone. Laughter, weeping, cries all reinforced obedience. Ordinary citizens were not spared. Streets cleared for parades of shame. Slaves forced to act as extensions of his lust. The divine became debased. Sacred rituals turned into displays of domination. Every corner whispered of his appetite. Through public depravity, Caligula revealed a harsh truth. Absolute power corrupts even society's most intimate structures. Lust became spectacle. Morality twisted. Terror normalized. Rome had built armies, monuments, and laws to protect its people. Under Caligula, all could be warped into instruments of humiliation. The city shivered under a ruler whose pleasure was law, whose whim was destiny, whose theatre of lust left scars long after his reign. Caligula's cruelty extended beyond humans. His madness spilled into the absurd, blending lust, fear, and spectacle in ways that stunned even loyal Romans. Horses received honors. Incitatus, his favorite, had a marble stall, jeweled collar, and invitations to dine with senators. Some said he planned to make the horse consul a grotesque mockery of governance. Symbols and rituals became tools of mockery. Temples were desecrated, gods reduced to puppets of his whim. Priests and senators were forced to participate. Their dignity turned against them. Rome had always loved spectacle, gladiators, triumphs, festivals. But Caligula replaced honor with mockery, devotion with fear, and tradition with grotesque absurdity. Even his laughter carried menace. Witnesses described delight mixed with threat, a reminder that obedience was expected not just from bodies, but from minds. Every absurd act was a lesson. Reality itself could be twisted, and nothing in Rome was untouchable. In this kingdom of cruelty, animals, symbols, and the sacred became instruments of terror. Madness had method. Absurdity was law, and through it all Rome trembled, knowing the emperor's appetite had no end, no reason, and no mercy. No reign of terror lasts forever. Absolute power carries its own poison. Choosing to re-men in the very mapuan, you were meant to escape drunk on divinity, and debauchery had alienated senator soldiers, and even the Praetorian Guard. Fear replaced loyalty, and whispers of conspiracy crept through marble halls. On a fateful day in the Palatine Palace, daggers waited. The assassins moved silently, striking a man who had made Rome his instrument of pleasure and pain. Caligula fell, struck not by foreign armies, but by those who once obeyed him without question. The killing was brutal. Strikes in the heart, screams echoing through cold corridors. The emperor's body sprawled across marble. Drusilla's memory, his indulgences, his madness, all ended together. Rome was stunned, bewildered, momentarily free from a reign of grotesque terror. Even in death, his shadow lingered. Citizens whispered of humiliations, desecrated sanctities, and public spectacles that had turned the city into a stage of fear. Senators breathed again. Nobles mourned lost honor. Priests returned to temples with trembling hands. Yet the lessons of tyranny were carved into memory. Rome survived, but the cost was clear. Unchecked power corrodes not just a ruler, but the soul of the city. Caligula's fall was swift, violent, and necessary. A warning etched in blood, marble, and fear. Caligula's reign reflected the darker side of unchecked power in his hands. Rome's sacred bonds, family, religion, morality became tools of terror. The city, which had conquered lands and built monuments, fell victim to a man who understood the greatest conquest lies within the hearts and fears of those around him. History remembers him not just for cruelty or lust, but for the lesson in his madness.